So, vielen Dank. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Merci beaucoup. Sehr geehrte Kolleginnen und Kollegen,
colleagues, I declare the Conference of Presidents meeting open. It's open to all members of the Parliament, and I thank the EPP group that they've allowed us to use their group meeting room as a sort of replacement plenary chamber. Mr. Daul, I think you'll feel at home, and Mrs. Merkel also, I hope. I welcome the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Angela Merkel, in our midst.
die sich freundlicherweise bereit.
She has been willing to come here and address our meeting, and in a moment I'm going to give her the floor, but I'm going to make a few introductory remarks. Then we'll hear from the group leaders and those who have been put forward as speakers by the groups. And I would urge you to stick to the speaking time that's been agreed. The Chancellor has other appointments and has to go to London after this for further important meetings. Chancellor Merkel, you've seen that because we're not in a plenary, we're not sitting in group order, we're sitting in a mixed format, which is surprising to me because I look to my left. That's where the strongest applause came from when you came in the room, but that's unusual. Perhaps that gives us an indication of later discussions. But Mrs. Merkel is going to speak to us as in this mixed format, this open format. This has been discussed for some time, this possible meeting, and it was going to be an address in plenary, and for technical reasons that was not possible today, and that's why we're here. But I have the impression that this will be something like a plenary in terms of atmosphere, and later there will be a special council, and as Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel has agreed to take part in the midterm financial planning for the EU. You know what the plans of the European Parliament are there. You know the content of these plans, but you know the budgetary developments and the budgetary background to that. I would inform you that the decision of the Parliament on the Berger-Kalfin report, in which the Parliament's position is set out on the midterm planning, was adopted with a majority of more than 500 votes across parliamentary groups, and that's a large majority which demonstrates that the Parliament has very strong support for these measures. And I wanted to introduce this meeting by saying that if anyone wants Europe to succeed, they have to be willing to compromise, and the Parliament is willing to compromise. We set out our starting positions through our negotiations, and we've negotiated all of those and come to fair compromises. Obviously, we are not categorical. We don't just set out our positions and say otherwise it's a veto, it's a no. Otherwise, we wouldn't be representing our people. We would be giving a veto to them. The European Parliament is willing to compromise, but is also ready to fight. Oh, yes, you may applaud. I'm also glad that we're going to have discussions on the debate in December on the adaptation of the European Union to current developments in the future. But without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to the Chancellor. You have the floor.
President, dear Martin Schulz, distinguished members, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy that I can speak to you today, and this is the first opportunity since the German EU presidency in 2007 to speak to you and I'd like to use this opportunity to give you my view of the situation in the Union. Not necessarily about the mid-term financing, but I'm sure we can do that in the forthcoming discussion. In 2 days, on the 9th of November, will be the anniversary of the opening up of the Berlin Wall, the 23rd anniversary. The 9th of November 1989 was a happy moment in the history of Germany and Europe. It stands for the start of an era of freedom, an era of open unity in democracy in Germany and Europe. We Germans will never forget that the fortunate development of our country cannot be divided from the history of the European Union. We'll never forget that we also owe this to the bold striving for freedom of our eastern neighbours. We Germans are aware of a responsibility for a good future in the Union, and in this consciousness, the German government is conducting politics for our country, but also for Europe. I would like to point out a basic motive behind the European Union, freedom, which makes a life of freedom and prosperity possible. Freedom in all its facets, freedom of expression, the press, of belief and association. This deserves to be defended all the time. Without freedom, there is no rule of law. Without freedom, there is no diversity and no tolerance. Freedom is the basis for a united and decisive Europe. And in this great test which Europe has to get through today, the power of freedom can help us to bring Europe stronger out of the crisis, because the power of freedom, this is my conviction, gives us the courage for change. And it is this courage for change that we need to show now, so that our union can maintain itself in international competition in the 21st century. In my travels outside of the European Union, for example in Asia, in recent years I have got to know very many dynamic, ambitious countries. There people look towards us, the European Union. But I'm often asked skeptically there, will the European experiment stand up to the crisis? This question makes it clear the current difficult crisis dominates the perception of us, the European Union, also outside of Europe. So it's up to us now to change this sceptical view of Europe and to catch up in global competition and through hard work internally. Therefore, it's not just a great honour that the European Union was awarded the Nobel Prize for Freedom this year. This important prize, in the middle of the most difficult crisis in Europe since the passing of the Treaties of Rome 55 years ago, is a very valuable political signal to the world and also to us, the Europeans. Martin Schulz will accept the prize together with the President of the European Council and the European Commission in Oslo. And I'm happy that some of my colleagues, including myself, have decided to take part in the ceremony. We want to underline thereby that the European Union is us all, us together, the 500 million citizens. And we all know, we Europeans, luckily, we are united. The Nobel Prize for Freedom means that we should never forget this, and however great the challenges are, and however difficult our everyday is, the Nobel Prize Committee calls on us in its decision to put back into the centre of things what is absolutely essential in the current crisis. It isn't the debts, the labour costs or growth rates, even though those are important. The important thing is more the realisation that our common currency is much more than just a currency. It is the symbol for the successful, peaceful and democratic unity of Europe. It is a symbol of a Europe of freedom, prosperity and progress. So, what it's all about at the moment is that the fortune of European unity should be preserved for our children. So, the Nobel Prize commits us all to create a better union, a Europe of stability and strength. Martin Schulz was right when in his speech as the newly elected President of the European Parliament, and I quote, "Either we'll all lose or we will all win." Our common position, ladies and gentlemen, can only be we will win together, and we will win together. That is my goal. And together, we can maintain our European model, which includes economic success and social responsibility, and more. Together, we can consolidate it so that it is stronger than ever. And together, we must remember the power of freedom and have the courage to change. The first successes of our efforts to get over the crisis are already evident, both at the level of member states, but also when it comes to developing new instruments to deal with the crisis. But we shouldn't be satisfied with what has been achieved. Much less to be done, and the trust in the European Union as a whole needs to be re-won. So we mustn't stop halfway. And I'd like to make a promise to you today. Germany will do everything so that the Union can keep its promise of freedom and prosperity in the future. And I'm here because I count on your support, because those forces are increasing who think that we can lean back and we don't need to reform the economic and monetary union because the crisis measures that have been taken are enough. I think that's wrong. Instead of leaning back, we must make sure, step by step, at all levels of the Union, that the strengths of Europe can be attained. Freedom, the dynamism and prosperity which the European Union can offer, and the assertion and the influence which the European Union can create for us outside in the world. The President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, and his speech on the State of the Union on the 12th of September before this Parliament said, and I quote, "We must complete the economic and monetary union." And indeed, we must find the right way now to stabilize the economic and monetary union permanently so that we remove the basic errors in it. We must be courageous and ambitious, and we mustn't hold back from a change in the economic and monetary union treaties if that is necessary. This deepening process is essential, and I see you, the European Parliament, and also the European Commission as allies in this process. I want to say that very expressly. For the current crisis situation, there is no previous example. The European Union is a unique construct. Therefore, now we must do what Europe is famous for, quite rightly. We must be inventive, and we must find our own new solutions. All member states must carry out reforms, structural adaptations, and tough consolidation measures for more competitiveness in order to fight the causes of the crisis. And I know that in some countries affected by the crisis, this particularly affects the citizens and requires a lot from them. And I know that the people there are suffering from the measures. But in this difficult time, I can give you a good piece of news. The reforms are showing first successes. The efforts haven't been in vain. It's been worth it. In Ireland, Portugal and Spain, but also in Greece. Labour costs have come down a lot, and this is an important factor for competitiveness. Also, the deficits in their balances of payments are going down. The consistent reforms of the member states for more competitiveness are flanked by the solidarity of Europe. For example, through the new permanent rescue mechanism, the ESM. Both things belong together. both are equally important. Sustainable consolidation and growth require each other. Both must be pursued equally. I want to say that once again, because at the moment we seem to see things as opposites, play them off. We need both. We need new growth and employment on the basis of solid budgets. We have a responsibility for future generations, that we don't remove their margin for manoeuvre. Growth comes from entrepreneurial activity. Growth is nothing which we can define politically. We must have people in Europe who are active as entrepreneurs. This activity comes from freedom and the necessary flexibility, and here we must work for this in Europe. Therefore, the Euro Plus package has measures with which growth and employment can be strengthened in the member states. And we have the fiscal pact, a pact for growth and employment, which has been flanked onto this. On the one hand, it's about a targeted spending of public funds, but money isn't everything. So we also have the preconditions for new growth, above all, by energetically continuing the single market. The legal aspects of the pact must be carried out, and we will set free growth, and that's important for our future. The Council and I think the Parliament are committed to that. The medium-term financial framework for the Union, which will be decided in the European Council in 2 weeks, a fundamental precondition so that we create the impulses for growth. Every euro, this must be our goal, which we spend, must have an added value in terms of growth and employment. It's not enough to spend money. Above all, it must be invested in a targeted way. And we must look at our policies in that light. And we must look critically at the founding errors in the architecture of the Economic and Monetary Union, and to remove them. If we do those two together, that's the only way we'll be successful in the long term. That's the only way we can have a strong and stable Europe. With the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, 20 years ago, the Economic and Monetary Union was created. Back then, those who wanted to have a true economic union didn't find a support. We had a monetary union with a communitarized monetary policy. The monetary union, however, was only constructed weakly, and this has, and we have to fight with the consequences of that. So the differences in competitiveness in the member states have got bigger rather than getting smaller, and we only have to look at the developments in labour costs. Jean-Claude Trichet, president of the ECB, pointed that out, but wasn't listened to. In some member states, it was possible for years to take on more debt without being penalised as they should have been under the Stability and Growth Pact. This all makes very clear the problems that we are faced with today. These are partly caused well before the current crisis broke out, and the problems are different in each member state. It's a question of public debt, bank crisis, debts in the private sector, lack of competitiveness, and the worldwide financial and economic crisis in 2008 and 2009. Developments here were exacerbated. But if all member states had stuck to the limits agreed upon and carried out reforms so that they've to increase competitiveness, the Economic and Monetary Union, even if the currency union had been weak, would never have run into a crisis. But the mixture of homemade violations and became fateful for Europe. Therefore, we need to learn the lesson of the crisis. We must make sure that this situation is not repeated, and we must make sure that Europe comes strengthened out of the crisis. It means the errors made when the Economic and Monetary Union was created must be analysed. We must renew its basis, and nationally in the member states we must create reliability by sticking to what we commit ourselves to. One example is that we as heads of state and government, or our predecessors, for example, agreed that each member state in the European Union should devote 3% of its GDP to research and development. We have countries which spend 0.7%. We have countries which spend 3.5%, but nobody really stuck to what we agreed upon. So, for me, 4 elements are key for the future. First of all, a renewed economic and monetary union needs more common financial market policies. It is based on functioning and robust financial markets, and we must create the must define the framework of the financial markets better and harmonise financial market regulation at the European level, and make sure at the worldwide level that this succeeds in international financial markets. On top of that, we must have an effective European supervisory mechanism for European banks, so that we can avoid systemic risks for our economic system. The decisions of the European Council recently have made it clear that quality must go before speed. It's very important that our supervisory mechanism really works. So the complex legal issues have to be cleared up, because we need a banking supervision which is worthy of its name. Secondly, a renewed economic and monetary union needs more common fiscal policy. For strengthening budget discipline, we've already made progress with the fiscal pact. I'm happy that 11 member states of the 12 required have ratified, most recently France and Estonia. I could imagine going further, and at the European level, for example, we could have proper rights to intervene in national budgets where the agreed limits of the Stability and Growth Pact, if the agreed limits of the Stability and Growth Pact are not stuck to. Thirdly, a renewed economic and monetary union needs more common economic policy. We can see it very clearly today. We didn't have, and we don't have, economic policy coordination which is binding enough. So there's no possibilities in the monetary union to have the necessary direction in nationally for strengthening competitiveness and to have a basis for growth. Commission President Jacques Delors in 1989, in his report on setting up an economic and monetary union, he pointed out the importance of both pillars of economic and monetary union, and I quote him: "An economic monetary union without sufficient degree of economic policy convergence won't succeed, and it could be harmful to the community." That is what Jacques Delors said in 1989. The crisis has shown how right the analysis of Jacques Delors was. It has shown that developments in some member states could bring the monetary union in trouble, and so we're still at the beginning when it comes to the necessary strengthening of economic policy coordination. So what can be done? In the European Council in October, we had a preliminary discussion, and we agreed, and that in those areas of policy which are important for the functioning of the economic and monetary union, we need to take a look more exactly and at an earlier stage, because the loss of competitiveness in some member states becomes a problem for all. A stronger economic policy coordination might be required in situations where key areas of national sovereignty are touched upon. I'm thinking of sensitive areas of policy like labour market policy or tax policy.
Obviously, here we have to be cautious. The subsidiarity principle and national democratic procedures must be complied with. We need solutions which strike a sensible balance between new powers at European level, rights of intervention, and the usual scope of the member states and their parliaments and their ability to act. The European institutions must be strengthened to genuinely correct any inadequate or failing procedures and infringements of the rules, and we must have a new exchange between European and national levels. I would support a new arrangement, a new nuanced procedure in the framework of which member states, with the support of their parliaments, can adopt reforms which are binding and which it's possible to implement in conjunction with the European level. I can also imagine that we would have targeted incentives for a new financial instrument for the Eurozone, which could generate solidarity. Here is this is an idea for the future, which would require a proper legal basis, which we are going to decide on at the EU Council in December in the context of these measures, which will lead to a deepening of, which would require a deepening of the EMU. I will be supporting an ambitious plan of action in December for the new EMU. There should be concrete measures for all our partners. This is important. We shouldn't have a division in the European Union, and it's not about doing anything against the European Parliament or the European Commission. What I'm saying is purely about the necessary interaction between the different levels and arranging this so that it can really work in the sense of greater economic cooperation that Jacques Delors talked about. And I think we can achieve this. We can achieve trust and credibility in the long term that is sustainable. That is the aim of all our efforts, because this national debt crisis lies at the heart of the crisis of confidence. And we have to very carefully rebuild that confidence, and renewing the economic and monetary union will help European citizens who are represented here in the European Parliament, and I put my support behind that. I understand the concerns about divisions in an EU of 27, soon 28, and the Eurozone of 17. And I can counter that by saying that, first of all, the economic and monetary union is essential for a good future of the European Union, and secondly, a renewed economic and monetary union will also be open for the participation of non-Euro states. The Euro countries are not a closed club. The EMU was founded with the aim of all countries taking part, and I would support a deeper EMU which doesn't lead to, and I would say it wouldn't lead to, a two-speed Europe, but a doubly powerful union. I'm also firmly convinced that an aim of Europe based on stability and strength can only be achieved if the member states and the union's different bodies work together. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm also aware of concerns about nationalisation of Europe, about renationalisation. I'm convinced if we do the right things, in other words, if we really learn the lessons of the crisis, we will achieve the very opposite. What we will see is that we will see in fast motion the national becoming more European. And this is something that we must recognise as an opportunity and take that opportunity. If we are capable of understanding and grasping that we are stronger together than if we act as individual nations, then we will succeed. The national parliaments will increasingly like governments, shoulder their responsibility for integration of the Union. The President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, in a speech in Brussels in February this year, talked about national parliaments as European institutions in the political sense. And so we can summarise these ideas by saying that Europe is That's all of us together, and Europe is a matter of internal policy, of domestic policy. A stronger dialogue with the national parliaments, the members of the European Parliament is essential for a good future of the Union. I am convinced that we can create a Europe of stability and strengths, and to do that we need more democratic legitimacy and control. It's decisive for me. This legitimation and control has to be set at the right level, the level at which decisions are made and implemented. If there is more, this means that if there is more sovereignty at the European level, the role of the European Parliament must also be duly strengthened. When national sovereignty is affected, when national competences are affected, national parliaments must also play an important role, a decisive role. We should also discuss openly how decisions at European level can be legitimated in the future if they only affect the Eurozone. For example, we have to think about whether to have members of parliament from non-Euro countries. Only members of parliament from the Euro states should be allowed to vote, and that's something that we have to consider carefully. Stronger democratic legitimation and control is a principle that must run through all measures that we take to deepen the economic and monetary union, and it should lie at the heart of a renewed union. Only through legitimation of the parliaments can we have genuine legitimation of these measures. President, ladies and gentlemen, since I am here in the European Parliament today, I am thinking back to the last German presidency in 2007. At the time, we were marking the 50th anniversary of the signature of the Treaty of Rome, and that was reflected in the Berlin Declaration. The former president of the Parliament, Hans-Gert Pöttering, signed that document for this august assembly. That signature in 2007 can now be seen with hindsight as a breakthrough in the difficult negotiations that led to the Treaty of Lisbon. It was about deepening the European Union overall, and now it's about deepening the economic and monetary union in order to achieve a more stable and a stronger European Union. In that Berlin Declaration in 2007, we said, our history exhorts us to protect the well-being of our citizens for future generations, and for that we have to continue to renew the political design of Europe. I'm convinced that it is only through that political design of the economic and monetary union in a timely fashion that we can meet our responsibilities. I'll come back to the beginning of my speech. I'm often asked the question, will the European experiment stand the test of the crisis? Well, as a physicist, I can say that I know something about experiments, and the European Union is far from being, is definitely no longer an experiment. It's a union which is now part of a very stable foundation and a stable structure. We have to have parameters which we can justify, which remain stable and strong. And as a politician, I would say we are certainly going to continue that successful recipe for European Union. It's about the freedom of our citizens, and it allows us to be creative as Europeans and to be courageous. United and decisive, we are stronger. United and decisive, we are able to take our economic model, our social model, and to defend it around the world. We can spread our model of peace, freedom, and well-being and prosperity around the world. That, and nothing less than that, should be our collective intention. I believe strongly in our collective European future. So, thank you.
Dein Puls ist schlecht. Gut, gut.
Vielen Dank, Frau Merkel. Wir eröffnen jetzt.
Thank you, Mrs. Merkel. I'll open the debate. First of all, the chairman of the EPP group, Joseph Daul, for 7 minutes.
Sechs. Ich wollte großzügig sein, aber Josef, dann spricht nur 6 Minuten. Bitte schön.
So, Joseph has the floor for 6 minutes. President of the European Parliament, Mr. Schulz, Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, colleagues, it's a pleasure and an honour to have you amongst us, Madam Chancellor, and at a decisive moment for Europe. For 60 years now, we've had peace and prosperity, and the Nobel Peace recently accorded to the European Union underlines this, as you rightly said. Nonetheless, we are at a crossroads. Either we can relaunch Europe based on peace, prosperity and competitiveness, or alternatively we are going to find ourselves in an impasse. The debate on the multiannual financial framework reflects the choice that we have to make. In the EPP, we know that this isn't just a budgetary issue. We feel that we need to go further than this. The question is how we can support this project which guarantees our prosperity and our future and primarily supports future generations. We are convinced that the European budget is indispensable if we are to get out of this crisis. We need to invest, therefore, in Europe. Let me remind you that 95% of the European budget is devoted to investment which not only benefits the member states, but also, thanks to the leverage effect, mobilises other financing. And that is something that only a European budget can do. So, I don't really understand, therefore, Council's position, I must admit, which on the one hand supports our strategy of the Europe 2020 strategy, but calls for more commitment, but then tries to cut spending. We need to be brave. We need to be consistent. That means that we need a budget that reflects our ambitions, obviously adapted to the difficult times we're going through. We need investment in research, in development, and also in innovation, which are the factors for growth and diversity which lead to employment in Europe. We have to follow this through. We are convinced, Madam Chancellor, that it is more than time that we have a debate, and we look to you for this, on own resources. Own resources are something that we need to guarantee the European budget and to ensure the value added of Europe, as well as to relieve national budgets. We're being told that we need new fiscal capacity to improve the competitiveness of Europe. That is true. Some in Council feel that by reducing the European budget, they will be able to create a new mini-budget. But what does that mean? I don't know. I don't understand. If we can't finance our main budget, how can we finance a second budget? Good common sense means that this is not easy to understand at all. So if this were done, I would ask European Parliament to take this to the Court of Justice so that a ruling would be given that would make it easy to understand. Dear colleagues, we have to reinforce our economic and monetary union too, and we have an answer for that. We have to implement the legislation that already exists. The six-pack needs to be applied and fully applied. The four-pack has to be applied, and the single market also needs to be completed as a motor for growth. We need more fiscal and social harmonisation too. What we don't need are new institutions, and you said that, and I would thank you, or indeed a budget for the Eurozone. Our Parliament, the European Parliament, is the Parliament of the Eurozone area. It's in this forum that we carry out democratic, transparent debates which are responsible with the European Central Bank. And it's wrong to say, as some people do, that the euro concerns only 17 countries. It concerns all of the member states. In passing, I have to say too, to all of those who talk to me of a Parliament of the Eurozone, I will say that the commissioners, the directors, the judges, the ministers of a certain nationality do say that this is the case, but we don't need this. And this is an issue that has been raised again and again at the moment. Then, on the question of the British rebate and Britain saying no, I'm not trying to stigmatise anybody, but the alliance between the Socialists and the Conservatives is necessary, and I am wondering, and I would ask you, whether it is necessary to bring together in the next Council, when it's only one country, if you look at the texts, that wants to and plans to block everything. So could we perhaps save the money of the Council meeting and ask all the questions that should be dealt with there beforehand? For the first time, national parliaments have forbidden any negotiations by the governments. That's not exactly something that we can call progress. My viewpoint is very clear. Europe was based thanks to compromise, thanks to the method that we have, the community method, rather than a collection of markets and currencies. Europe is based on values, solidarity and responsibility. We will only be successful if we stop having a national view of European policies. We have to stop coming out of European summits and talking to the national press of the successes that have been obtained as though they were just national issues. We have to be brave enough to talk about European interests. Madam Chancellor, thank you. You have that courage. Sovereignty is our sovereignty today. It's European sovereignty, even if only because 27 national sovereignties cannot solve the crisis individually, considering the situation in the world. We want a European future. We want a European defence. We want a European Germany. We want 27 European states. We want a united Europe. We want an integrated Europe. We want a political Europe. That is truly in the interests of Europe. Moving to German.
Frau Merkel. Sie haben
To you, Mrs. Merkel. You talked about European history. You've had an intensive experience of that in your own life. Your own life shows how important a united and free Europe is. We in the EPP have trust in you that you will continue to shape European Union. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Daul. War doch gut, dass
Mr. Daul, it was good I gave you 7 minutes after all. The loudest applause, to begin with, came from Mr. Cohn-Bendit, who's fully supports Mr. Daul. That's new, too. Next speaker is Mr. Swoboda for the Social and Democratic Group.
Zuerst möchte ich mich herzlich bedanken, dass Sie gekommen sind. Ich schätze Sie.
I'm glad that you've come, Chancellor. I admire you personally. I admire your commitment to Europe, but I then have to ask myself about national German policy for the EU. You know much better than I do, Chancellor, that the German economic miracle was based on the good social conditions that we have had in Germany. That you've had in Germany. Now, with the Troika, we've seen the breakdown of social networks. In Greece, you've seen what's happened. You've been there recently. And you said, yes, we have to come to an agreement with the Troika, but you know perfectly well that the Troikas actually break up the social networks that you need in Germany for your economic policies to work. Chancellor, you talked about freedom. What about the millions of unemployed people? What are they going to do with their freedom from work, freedom from employment? Here are new statistics showing that unemployment is going up in Europe. We can't just stay with our arms folded contemplating that. And that's new statistics on unemployment. Chancellor, you've said that we need to change the economic and monetary union. But why so hesitant? Why are we having to have a new type of banking union? Why are you having to deal in this way with François Hollande? The banking union, that's not working. Recapitalisation isn't working. Look at Spain. Are we going to leave Spain and Ireland out in the cold in this crisis and not help them? I think we should help them. You talked about the debt crisis, Madam Chancellor. I would have to correct you. As you know, Spain didn't have public debt at the beginning. They had debt that led to a banking crisis, where this process started. And today we have different interest rates, and Germany, Austria and other countries cannot just sit back at those. There's extreme discrepancies between interest rates that make it impossible for Spain, Portugal and Greece to get out of this crisis. Why don't you look at what your own council, your own redemption fund plans in Germany that have been recommended? Why don't you take notice of that? Chancellor, it's not about pooling debts at community level. It's about working on capital markets. It's about working together to reduce interest rates for those countries which are beaten down by these differences in interest rates that are unacceptable at the current rates that we see on the markets. You talked about Jacques Delors. I think you're talking about a different European history. Jacques Delors talked about how important investment is to keep Europe together. You talked about growth and investing in education and research, but you know perfectly well that these are all in decline, greatly in decline, because countries are forced to adopt austerity measures. They can't afford to invest in research and investment. That is also unacceptable. Chancellor, you talked about Jacques Delors and Helmut Kohl. That's your right and your entitlement, of course. But I think there's a different angle to that aspect of history. And when those in the future talk about this, they're going to have to think about the millions of unemployed, the increasing unemployment rates, social problems in your country and in others. This is something that we must respond to. And now I would briefly come to the budget. Chancellor, yes, I'm sure you have a much more reasonable approach to the budget than the UK or elsewhere, but there's something very decisive here. If you look at Horizon 2020 or others, R&I and cutbacks there, unfortunately, on the basis of Cyprus presidency proposals, well, we see that we need to counter that by saying that growth and investment in the European Union budget shouldn't be cut back. They are part and foundation of a reasonable European budget. Finally, Chancellor, you are a physicist. You reminded us of that again today. As a physicist, you are used to experiments, but if an experiment doesn't work, surely you have to give up that experiment and try something else. When you see extremity in austerity policies, not saving money, I'm talking about extreme austerity, you have to give up that experiment and move forward with growth, policy of growth and investment and job creation, because those unemployment people, we have to do something for them. And there's the youth unemployment as well, which is something that we cannot sit back and accept. Thank you.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die Fraktion der
Now for the Liberal Democrats group, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor, first of all, thank you for your intervention. You didn't repeat it this afternoon, but a few days ago, you said that the crisis could be over in 5 years. I think that what was you said in a meeting with the CDU. And I have to tell you, I am by nature an optimist, but honestly, I have to tell you, I have my doubts about this. And why? Because all the measures that we impose today have no effect at all if we don't tackle at the same time what is, in my opinion, the real origin of the crisis. And the origin of the crisis, the real cause of this crisis, is, in my opinion, today political. It has an economical fallout. There are financial consequences, but mainly it's a political crisis. And the real origin of this crisis is, in fact, the absence of a state authority today behind the euro. A state authority behind the single currency. maybe a state can exist without a currency, but I don't think that a currency can exist without a state. And let me prove this with a few figures. We have in the Eurozone a debt of 90% today. And we pay an average interest rate, and Mr. Svoboda has mentioned Italy and Spain. The average in Europe for the moment in the Eurozone is 5%, with 90% of debt. And in the United States they have a debt of 103%, more than in the Eurozone. And they are paying less than 2% interest rate. And the world record holders of debt in the world are the Japanese. They have 226% of debt, the double of Italy. And they are paying today 1.5% of interest rate, the lowest rate in the world. Now, how this is possible? Those with the highest debt, the lowest rate. Well, I think that the explanation is very simple. Behind the yen there exists a real state, a central state in Japan. And behind the dollar there exists a budget of 24% of the GDP. And let's be honest, behind the euro there is nothing at all for the moment. And even a budget of 1% is seen as too high by a lot of your colleagues. And maybe what you can do, Mrs. Merkel, is you can mention these figures. The dinner tonight with Mr. Cameron can maybe a good opportunity to mention these figures tonight. So let's face the reality of today, and let's not longer think that with half measures we can solve the problem of the euro. The euro is unsustainable, and the euro can disappear if we don't create a real European state with all the building blocks, with all the ingredients as the Americans have already put in place, I should say, 200 years ago. And what does it mean? It means a true European government, a true European democracy, a real European budget, a real European treasury, and finally, don't forget, also a European bond market. A European bond market, what is the only way to solve the problem that Mr. Svoboda has mentioned here, that of the too high interest rates today in the European Union. That is the choice we have. Or we make the step to a federal Europe, or we have problems. And then finally, Mr. President, Chairman, a last word on the ECB. You have to know I have enormous respect for you as Chancellor of Germany, but what you have said on the case of Mr. Mersch was for us unacceptable. The opinion of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, is respectful and very clear. And what we expect is that the European Parliament is treated in the same way as you will treat the German Bundestag on domestic matters. European democracy, dear colleagues, is as legitimate as German democracy.
Das Wort hat jetzt
Next speaker for the Green Group and the Free European Alliance, Rebecca Harms.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us today, Madam Chancellor. We remember you as the European head of government who got the Lisbon Treaty going. So a discussion with you about the functioning of European democracy is so interesting. I understood you to say that you want to send out the message that nobody in Germany is following the plan to split the European Parliament. The suggestions coming from Germany I understood differently. And I would like to make it very clear to you that I can't imagine that in future in the European Parliament, when it comes to tough decisions on economic and the fiscal union, for example, the Polish colleagues would leave the room before the vote. I can't imagine that somebody who knows European history, that is behind the idea of having a European Eurozone Parliament. I can't imagine either that you are are thinking of a Eurozone budget when nobody knows where the money would come from. Perhaps you can discuss that with Mr. Cameron. And when it comes to European history, I think it's good that you have pointed out freedom and democracy. But as I know the eastern and southeastern parts of the European Union, that the promise of a better life and justice has been an engine for the big movements that we've seen in the eastern part of the European continent. When I look at the result of crisis politics, I can't see that the goal of justice has been pursued appropriately. I think it's depressing that more and more people are worried about what their future looks like. Greece is just one part where you can see where one side of austerity policy can lead to. And you won't find anybody in this House who would say we're against saving. What has been contentious in this House is one-sided austerity policies. After 35 crisis summits, I've stopped counting how many times we've tried to agree with the Council in Brussels. The outcome of the most summits has been it'll get better now. It's got worse. We're in a downwards spiral. The European Union, through one-sided policies in recent years, has been driven apart. And we've been told by the IMF that this vicious circle is getting worse, which starts with austerity policies and leads to recession, and that's getting worse. If Portugal, Spain, Italy and other states will follow Greece, that's something which you ought to note as an analytical physicist. Germany should get over this one-sided approach and have a new debate about the other instruments which we need urgently, not to keep the euro stable, but to keep the European Union together. Thank you for your attention.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die europäischen.
And now for the European Conservatives and Reformists, Mr. Callanan.
Vielen Dank, Frau Bundeskanzlerin. That's the extent of my German. The German members have been extensively tutoring me on that small little bit. As the first British MEP to speak in this debate, and as an occasional reader of Der Spiegel, let me start by saying that I hope that you're not getting too much of these Muppets, Statler and Waldorf, in what people are saying to you today. Frau Merkel, I wish that more EU nations had Germany's economic discipline and enterprising spirit, because if they did, I think we'd be meeting here today under entirely different circumstances. And I personally have a great deal of sympathy for German taxpayers, because they were never told 15 years ago that this major EMU project would require them to make such large sacrifices to sustain the single currency. And I think that if I were one of those German taxpayers, I think I would probably agree with your CSU or FDP colleagues, such as Mr. Soder or Mr. Westerwelle, and oppose more German money being used to prop up the Eurozone. And incidentally, I'd also be quite frustrated that group leaders of those parties in the Parliament here are saying such completely different things to their parties at home. But if I was a German politician, I think I would also be quite eager to force fiscal responsibility onto some Eurozone governments. And I agree with you that fiscal conservatism is in fact common sense. And as another famous woman politician once reminded us, Margaret Thatcher, the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. And if my money were used as a backstop for the euro, then I think I also would want to put in place foolproof measures to put in place to see that simply more borrowing and more spending could not take place after those countries had been rescued. The problem, Chancellor, as I see it, is what we are seeing on the streets of Athens today is what happens when economic sovereignty is surrendered to some higher Eurozone authority. It has shown us that if we remove the ability of voters to determine their own economic destiny, then we start the countdown to social unrest, and we may be seeing the same thing starting in Spain as well. And even the greatest optimist can see that the Eurozone governance arrangements that you've talked about today and want to put in place will take years to implement. Even Germany, I'm afraid, doesn't have the kind of money that would buy us enough time for those to be implemented. Already, the banking union timetable has slipped. Opening up the EU treaties would doubtless see many other countries negotiating for their own interests. My own country, I'm sure, would want to see some powers returned back to member states. And as some countries try to push ahead with more political integration, though you have to be aware that this vision is not shared by everybody else in the European Union, and only by listening instead of lecturing those with different points of view will we find a way forward. However, ultimately, the way I see it is that Germany is still left facing the same fundamental choices as it faced 2 years ago. Either you finally deliver the so-called big bazooka, use whatever analogy you like, or you allow those countries that are currently suffering under the shackles of an overvalued currency to break themselves free of those bonds. That could be delivered by restructuring the euro, particularly in some of the peripheral areas, or it could mean introducing a stronger currency for core nations, along the likes of the Guldenmark proposal of Professor Markus Kerber. Now, my group does not want to see the euro fail. However, we do want to put this crisis behind us so that we can start to focus on what should be our real challenge here in Europe. The challenge that is Europe's collective lack of global competitiveness. Our share of world trade is slowly declining. In the end, the root of all of our economic problems is our lack of strong growth, and achieving that strong growth requires free market economic reforms across the continent. And I hope that you and Germany will take the lead in starting to pursue some of those reforms. Thank you, Chancellor, for coming today.
Für die EFD-Fraktion hat jetzt das Wort.
For the EFD now, Mr. Farage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Chancellor Merkel. So you're off to Downing Street to negotiate the EU budget with David Cameron. And you do so against the backdrop of the Court of Auditors yesterday, for the 18th year in a row, failing to give the accounts a clean bill of health. You do so against the vote in the House of Commons last week, where a majority of MPs were asking for reductions in the EU budget. And, of course, you do so with a growing anger in Britain. Why are we pumping £53 million a day of British taxpayers' money into this union? Not that that'll matter a bit. Cameron's a very weak Prime Minister. And I'm sure you'll walk all over him tonight and win that negotiation. But the EU budget isn't really the question. It's Britain's place in this union that is the real question. And increasingly, Britain looks like a square peg in a round hole. You see, we didn't join the Eurozone. And that means that every time you have one of your summits in Brussels, when the big debates are going on, there is actually nothing for the British Prime Minister to say. And in fact, if we do say anything, we're now seen as the dog in the manger. The fact is, Chancellor, you are leading the Eurozone on a journey to a much more deeply centralised and, I think, more fundamentally undemocratic Europe. But nonetheless, we simply can't join you on that journey. Whether it is harmonisation of financial market regulations, as you said today, whether it's the financial transaction tax, whether it's the banking union, Cameron is forced into the position, time and time again, where there is nothing he can say other than no. Because British public opinion, and now as the Labour Party appears to have discovered a bit of Euroscepticism, or at least a bit of opposition, he cannot join these conversations. Now, I sense in Brussels, not from you, but certainly around this chamber, an increasing growing hostility to the United Kingdom's membership of this union, and indeed there are many here that blame the Anglo-Saxon markets in London and New York for the faults of the Eurozone. Wouldn't it be better, Chancellor, tonight, if you went to Downing Street and said to Mr Cameron, look, this simply doesn't work anymore. It really is time that the United Kingdom left the European Union. He hasn't got the courage to say it himself, but if you said it to him, it might have an impact. All I'm suggesting, Chancellor, is that we have a simple, amicable divorce, and then we'll all get on much better in the future.
Thank you. For the GUI Group. Now, Mrs. Zimmer.
Ich weiß gar nicht, ob mir jetzt Herr Cameron leid tun soll.
Okay, Kolleginnen und Kollegen, das Wort hat...
Please, colleagues, let Ms. Zimmer speak. Well, I don't know whether I should say anything about David Cameron. I don't really want to go that far. Chancellor, you touched on history a number of times in your speech. I think that's a good thing. We've had today Obama's victory, the 95th anniversary of the October Revolution, a great socialist day, and you've touched on other historical events.
Aber meine Damen und Herren,
Augenblick, Frau Zimmer. Frau Zimmer.
Ms. Zimmer.
Kolleginnen und Kollegen, wussten...
Well, I don't really want the October Revolution to cause such enthusiasm in the aisles. Well, I've mentioned it, says Ms. Zimmer, because you, like me, experienced the winds of change in 1989, and one of the consequences was a system where there were social freedoms, individual freedoms. That's something that those two things couldn't work together for any length of time. And now the policy that's been adopted vis-à-vis Greece and other countries in the periphery of Europe, a policy of austerity that forces people into poverty, it forces them to lose their jobs, SMEs are failing, they don't have any future and are not going to succeed. Austerity kills. Some of my members from my group have got that message across to you before this meeting, and I would refer to you to the Social Rights Committee of the Council of Europe. They've suggested a number of measures. There was a memorandum on Greece where they infringed the social charter. That is one of the claims for the minimum wage for those under 25. It's also one of the measures is also the extension of the time period for redundancies. There are further measures. You've talked about increasing working time. You've overseen cutbacks in wages, and that's where I would urge you to put an end to these policies, because they're nothing to do with, they don't lead to success. If you cut wages, it doesn't succeed, and that is not to be used as an argument for these reforms. It's not reality. This is not going to increase competitiveness. What's the use of competitiveness when people are going to the wall? Now you're having to. Now other countries are going to have to bear the consequences, bear the brunt of all these measures. Recently, in the EU, there was another word brought in, cohesion policy, to replace solidarity. And those policies were perverted by the process of adopting the budget and the financial frameworks. What we need is more money for the cohesion policy, not less. For all these tasks that the European Union has to do, there has to be money in the coffers. So stop the federal government's block on the contribution above 1%, because it simply doesn't work. We need more policies. And finally, before the President cuts me off, please consider this, and I would like to know the answer, whether in the Council there is a single member state who can say that with these cuts in the MAFFs, in development policy are a disgrace for the European Union. If we are going to shoulder the responsibility for that, with what's happening in non-member countries, food aid, other measures are having to be cut back to the value of 7 billion euros. That is a disgrace for the European Union and for us.
Thank you, Mrs. Zimmer. For the non-attached, colleague Sosa Wagner.
Frau Merkel,
Frau Bundeskanzlerin.
Mrs. Merkel, Madam Chancellor, I'd like to thank you for your visit. You haven't forgotten, you shouldn't forget, that this building where we are is the home of European democracy. My question to you is this. The German Constitutional Court has determined the clause to be against the treaties, which is against the freedom of parties. I would like to know what the German government or the Bundestag proposes to do about it. Thank you, Mr. Sosa-Wagner. Mrs. Merkel, please. Yes. I only inform the President of my time, but it's similar to me. For me, I can speak. I would like to begin by answering Joseph Daul. I think we have a lot in common, but there's a question of the Eurozone budget, which has played a role for many of you. What I would like to see is that all member states in the European Union become members of the Eurozone. That is what the monetary union was about. If we'd said that in 25 years' time, not everybody would be members, we would have asked different questions. And now things have turned out differently, and we have to live with it. But this also means we need a certain amount of we won't achieve a certain degree of commitment for all member states, because some member states have more freedom. But those who have the common currency must be prepared to have a higher degree of commitment. If others want to join, I'd be happy, but I can't force them, because the common currency would fall to pieces otherwise. We need commitment on the one hand. On the other hand, I can see that certain tasks which in countries which are dealing with budget consolidation won't be completed. I'm convinced that if you want to deal with youth unemployment properly, you need properly educated young people. Spain and Portugal need to build up a vocational training system, but they'll be telling us that they can't do that in the near future. But I can't give that task, a binding task to Spain and Portugal, without saying at the same time, where will you get the financing from? I don't have any hope that all 27 would agree that these tasks can be done straight away. But everybody in Europe needs a vocational training system, but not everybody will be prepared to spend European money on that. So, first of all, I will like to deal with the maintenance of our euro, because it's important for us all. Then I can call for this commitment. Otherwise, I can't see any chance to get that from 27 at the same time. And if everybody is a member, or almost everybody is a member of the Eurozone one day, then we can have a stronger combination of structural funds and cohesion funds, a better way of spending, and more commitment. But we don't have that time with the euro. The international markets don't give us months, let alone years. Secondly, Mr. Swoboda, I've heard what you said, and I think that we agree that 50% youth unemployment in some of our member states isn't just terrible, it isn't worthy of Europe. So we must do everything to change that. I came to office at the time we had over 5 million unemployed in Germany. One reason I came into office was that a red-green German government made reforms against which part of their party bases were against. Social assistance levels were cut. There were dates about what was worthy. We had pension reforms, and the retirement age was increased. None of the parties came at that well. We had to to wait 5 years for the results. We have under 3 million unemployed at the moment. We have a reasonable budget situation. And the point is, if you go through Europe and say, we only have blind austerity policies, and to act as if structural agreements weren't necessary in the countries, then you'll be acting against the interests of the unions and employers in Europe. That's not right. Greece got into difficulties when the deficit was 15%. It wasn't. They didn't have the troika there. Nobody was making conditions. The deficit was 15%, and international investors decided that Greece wouldn't be offered money at reasonable rates anymore. That was the basis. And if we have the discussion that you just say to the Greeks, the situation is bad, but we can't change it. We have to say to them, it's not right that you strike every time if there's a privatization. It's not right that you have a railway system which can't cover its wages through ticket prices. It's not right if the government ministries don't work together. It's not right if you have a tax system but no taxes are paid. If we're not able in Europe to deal friendly and kindly to each other and act as if it's all guided supernaturally, we won't make any progress. We're 9% of the world population. We produce 25% of world GDP, and we have 50% of social expenditure in the world. If we think we can keep that and do everything without structural reforms, if we think we have untransparent labour markets, it's no wonder that our young people don't get a job. So I will fight for people, and I have my experience from Germany that has been right. And the social partnership helped us through these times. But our unions have reservations about raising the retirement age. It's up to politics to make the right decisions. So my request would be this. If Europe must change, where we haven't been looking at what happens in the rest of the world. 90% of economic growth takes place outside of Europe. If we shut our eyes, we won't be able to ensure our prosperity for the future. Mr. Verhofstadt now, of course, we don't have a state authority, but we failed at the constitutional treaty. How did that happen? The referendum in France and the Netherlands didn't work out, and elsewhere. We must take the populations with us towards more community, but we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And if we have and what happened, because the truth is this: when we introduced the euro, interest rates were low everywhere. It meant that the competitiveness of some countries became worse. So we'll have to make sure that we use our money to improve together. And I'm sure that the Commission will become a European government one day, and I'm sure that the Council will become a second chamber one day, and I'm sure that the European Parliament will take European responsibilities. Otherwise it won't work in the long term. But today we must save the euro and create the basis properly, and we must give people a little bit of time so that they can come with us. I think I've said a few things to Mrs. Harms already. You know from home, let's be honest, it isn't a one-sided austerity policy. The countries who have a program, also from the program, have more difficulties with the structural funds than with saving. They're taking savings measures, even though they ought to be reforming their labour markets. This preparedness to change is something we'll need. One word on the UK. I want to have a strong UK in the European Union. To make that absolutely clear, I come from Germany. The UK was with us when we were liberated from National Socialism. I can't imagine we had British soldiers still in Germany. I can't imagine that the UK wouldn't be part of Europe. And I think it's good also for the UK to be part of Europe. If you have a world of 7 billion, and if you're alone in that world, I don't think that's good for the UK. And so I'll do everything to keep the UK in the European Union as a good partner. And so that's why I'm going to London this evening. And I would ask the inhabitants of this wonderful island that you can be very happy, but you won't be happy if you're alone in this world. We're a strong Europe with 500 million. We're in favour of freedom, of democracy, and look round in the world and see where that isn't the case, and be happy that we're together. To Mrs. Zimmer, I just say this. You said so well that the wind of change has caused us in 1989, that was right, to have freedom. And in socialism, it was overseen that social and personal freedoms belong together. That's both right. But you know what was also overseen in socialism? That you can't make politics against people's economic understanding. That was a completely false system which forbade creativity. And if we just talk about the social issues today, just redistributing and others are working to create the money. That distribution doesn't work. Somebody has to be entrepreneurs. Somebody has to earn and pay taxes, and we need to encourage these people in Europe, the small enterprises, the big companies, and if we can create something there, we can distribute things in a just way. But then you have to see to that.
5%-Hürde.
Oh, the 5% barrier. We're committed in Germany to not to criticize the rulings of our constitutional court, but to accept them and to live with them. We don't know what the consequences of that will be. That'll be mostly up to the Bundestag, but I would just say to try 3% and fail again wouldn't be the right answer. It is difficult.
Die Bundeskanzlerin darf die Urteile.
Well, the Chancellor doesn't want to criticise the Constitutional Court's ruling, but the European Parliament is quite willing to do that. This ruling was a bad one and didn't reflect the actual factual role of the European Parliament.
So, jetzt.
Now, I suggest that we do this the other way round. Mr. Sousa Wagner, well, you gave me a full answer. Thank you.
Sie sind der totale Zeitökonom. Vielen Dank.
Well, that's a total, very good time saving. Mr. Farage.
Part of the EU or not, Chancellor, it's a very different European Union, isn't it? The 17 Eurozone countries are on a journey and are moving somewhere completely different, and every single proposal that you come up with, Mr. Cameron is forced to say no to. So we're going to find ourselves, effectively, as the Cinderella state, because you will make big decisions that affect the single market, of which we're a member, and we, in fact, according to you, even UK members of this Parliament won't be able to vote on issues that affect the Eurozone, which undeniably knock on to the single market. So I understand what you're saying, but frankly, we find ourselves now in a completely illogical position. I would have thought Britain has to be either wholly fully in or wholly fully out, and with a simple free trade agreement. And maybe Mr. Cameron will agree with you on this, but ultimately the British populace are seeking a totally new settlement.
Vielen Dank, Frau Zimmer.
Thank you, Mrs. Zimmer.
Ja, ganz kurz nur.
Very briefly on 2 points on the economy and business. as a foundation for creating income and thus pay for social measures. Of course, I agree, but in the conditions of austerity, in the next 15 to 20 years, in those countries that are the hardest hit, it is not going to be possible to have sustainable business being developed. And I would like to know whether this austerity policy and the sustainability policy can be implemented and whether we can do anything socially or about the environment. Secondly, you talked at one point about the European Parliament being an important partner for you in all crisis-related issues. Why then has the fiscal pact got to the point that it has, when it's already clear that that pact has 2 points that are conflicting with EU law in material and informal terms, and that hasn't been regulated at European level. And the implementation of the pact by the Commission, well, how can we go along with that if the Parliament is going to be excluded from that? You will have to deal with that on the 1st of the 1st. That's supposed to come into force. The fiscal pact is supposed to come into force then, but it will be impossible to implement it. So how are you going to reconcile that contradiction? Thank you. And Mr. Callanan next.
Chancellor, let me thank you very much indeed for coming here today. I think it's been an interesting discussion. We've certainly heard a lot of political rhetoric. We've heard not much economic reality from some members, but there we are. That's what we're used to in this chamber. Frau Zimmer seems to believe that the October Revolution, the death of 40 million people in Russia and the Soviet Union, was something to be celebrated, but that's what we get used to from some people on the left. Chancellor, I wish you well in your meeting with my Prime Minister this evening. You are, of course, fellow members of a group of nations asking the EU to exercise the same budgetary discipline that it requires of its members. Certainly David Cameron can rely on the support of his MPs to support that position. I think it's a shame that you can't seem to rely on the support of your own CDU MEPs to support your position. One of them is indeed asking for 136 million euros to waste on an unnecessary museum here in Brussels. I hope you could have a word with him and dissuade him that that is unnecessary spending in these current economic climates. I think we can all agree that as governments, local authorities, businesses and families right across the continent have to make less money go further, the EU should do the same and make every effort to cut its budget. We don't need a bigger budget, we need a better use of the existing budget. And I hope that you and David Cameron will be able to agree this evening on the need for budgetary restraint in the EU. In the UK now, as has been remarked, even the British Labour Party and Mr Swoboda's group actually want the budget to be cut. That's the environment that we live in the UK, and to simply allow the EU budget to keep on increasing year after year after year when austerity is being imposed on many member states, when we're seeing cutbacks in many other essential public services, is completely unsustainable. I'm sure that you and David Cameron will be able to agree on a mutually conclusive way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Harms. I would like to point out, I don't see the UK as strong, but as a country which requires internal reforms very much, seems to be deindustrialised. Greetings to Mr. Cameron and Mr. Miliband. I don't think with their anti-European position they can steer this country on a healthy course. Secondly, tomorrow I'll be travelling to Greece, so I've taken a close look at the current situation, and I think we must admit, finally, that with their reform attempts, they've exhausted everything. They've halved pensions, they've cut wages, which in Germany wasn't imagined even at the time of the Hartz IV. It's pure austerity policy directed from Germany, and they're doing that at times of the worst world economic crisis. That'll end in a disaster, and that must be recognised. Mrs. Merkel, if the Greeks can't be kept in on reasonable conditions then we won't be able to hold on to the other crisis countries either. It's a disgrace that Germany and certain other of the still rich countries are carrying out an experiment when it comes to the maintenance of the EU that can only be corrected sensibly when the crisis comes to roost. That's being shown now, but that is not right. It's not on this course which says, first of all, the reforms in the member state, and then we'll follow up with more EMU and more common decisions and more common responsibility. This will pull this European Union apart. I think if you're analysing things honestly, you would say that this course that you support is not tenable if Mr. Draghi and not Mr. Trichet to get over the malaise of politics through its bond buying policy that we haven't seen before. So an honest analysis and end this course of blockade from the donor countries which are still wealthy for now. Thank you, Mrs. Harms.
Herr Verhofstadt.
Mr. Verhofstadt.
Yes, I don't think that we disagree on the long term. The problem is the timing of the different steps. You are saying, yes, I agree with European government, I agree with the European Treasury, I agree with two federal chambers. Our point of view in the Parliament is that you need it now. That you don't solve the problem around the euro crisis if you don't put in place these things and these reforms. And let me give you one example. Let me give you the example of interest rates. What's happening today? Today what's happening is that the half of the austerity measures, I'm not against austerity. Not against austerity in the southern of Europe. I think it's necessary for growth on the long term. But half of the effect, half of the product of this austerity is used to pay higher interest rates to bondholders who are living outside Europe. What is happening is that German taxpayers' money today is used to pay high interest rates to bondholders outside Europe. That is the reality and the truth today. And there is an intelligent way to solve that. It's not coming from Belgium. Certainly not. It's coming from the Sachverständigenrat. It are your own economic advisors who are saying to you, create a mutualization of the debt, all the debt above 60%. And make it in that way that all these countries who participate are obliged to reduce their public debt. So it is strengthening fiscal discipline. We know it. And the Sachverständigenrat is saying it shall lower interest rates for countries like Spain and Italy so that we can recover. So that is my question to you. Why not doing that? Because in an intelligent way we could solve this crisis on a short-term basis. But I can tell you one thing, Mrs. Merkel. This Parliament has taken a position on this. We are negotiating with the Council on the two-pack, who is the follow-up of the six-pack. And the position of the Parliament is there is no agreement if there is no redemption fund inside the new package.
Vielen Dank, Herr Swoboda, bitte.
Mr. Swoboda, Chancellor, as a physicist, you appeal for various things. We've heard about Hartz IV, the welfare and minimum wage package. You can't apply these sort of things to other countries. In Spain, Portugal and Ireland, it's about property. All the points you've referred to, the necessary structural reforms and so on, I agree, but they are done in a different way. They're put under pressure in a different way. Why are these 2 years so controversial? Why are these the visit of Lagarde and so on, and the tickets, the flight tickets? It's really it's tax evasion and the flight of money that is the problem. Now, what has been said about the UK? Of course, the UK belongs to and should be part and remain part of the European Union, but in the City of London, they don't want Britain to leave. Yes, of course the populists, Mr Farage and company, do, but ordinary people, well, it might be a popular thing to do to moan about the European Union, but I don't really think they want to leave because they would suffer. So not political leaders and others who can do this for political purposes, but ordinary citizens. And lastly, on the budget, we do need a reasonable budget for growth. Others have said that, and you could perhaps say this to Mr Cameron. The British were those who fought for enlargement, and that's fine. Now the British, the Poles and the others who are here, and there was a foreign minister's speech from Poland, now they can say we don't need money from us. If you're for enlargement and one of the leading campaigners for enlargement, they have to be able to make funding available to all those countries. Otherwise, it's simply unfair. We are fighting for a fair budget, and you could say to Mr Cameron, here there is a strong determination. If the budget is rejected, vetoed, and there are massive cutbacks, we will fight for a reasonable, realistic, and a growth-oriented budget in Europe. That is the only way to be strong in the European Parliament. That's what we're going to do, and we call for your support.
Kollege Daul hat das Wort.
Mr. Daul.
I would like to support the idea of the amiable divorce put forward by Mr Farage, but if I may, I would say that we want to keep the children of the 26 other children, because I don't think that you should have custody of those children. So if we really are debating a friendly divorce, I think that all of the children should come into our custody, including the children from the British marriage. Chancellor, you've said quite rightly that any country that wants to join the euro, that isn't a member of the euro, can work with us on the basis of solidarity. I totally agree. And I have another proposal vis-à-vis solidarity. The British rebate, as my friend Mr Swoboda said, that should be used for the purposes of solidarity. We should no longer send it back. If we want to be serious about our budget, as I've said, I think we've always tried to have a serious budget. As I said, 96% goes on investments. There's only 3 or 4% of that which is fraud. So how do we explain if this isn't properly used? I don't agree, and I think the decisions that have been taken here, Mr Callanan, were taken on a majority basis. There was a majority vote in the European Parliament to use the budget, and as such we should shoulder our responsibilities. Mrs Merkel, I would ask you something else. I would ask that research and innovation policies, we had a major debate in our group this morning, and all of us talk about research and innovation policies, but where is European research now, which we should be supporting? And where is the innovation that we should be supporting? We really need to create them in the short term, and we need a bit of initiative so that we can, in fact, apply innovation and create jobs and growth. So we need Council to help us to get out of this impasse. We have spent 5 years to get out of a serious crisis. I'm sure we could have got out of it more quickly if we had allocated funds where we should have allocated them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daul. Mrs. Merkel, please. Briefly, to respond to just a few things. Mrs. Zimmer, as regards the legal basis of the fiscal treaty, first of all, what we'd like to see is we'd like to have done that within the European treaties. Some countries didn't want that, to do that, or wanted it only under conditions which would have had to do other treaty changes. For example, financial market regulation, which I didn't think was right. So we have the legal basis. So we have an intergovernmental agreement. We said very clearly that within 5 years we want that to be integrated into the European treaties. So, and not a complete new pillar being built up. And the Council, the legal services of the Council told us that the borrowing an organ is one way to go. So we need you. It's not down to me to put this into the European treaties as quickly as possible. Mrs. Harms, I know that a lot is being called of the people in Greece. I won't beat about the bush on that. Those in Greece who are very rich and have gone, and it's those who are having to pay the price who can't really afford it. For the sake of responsibility, the state apparatus of Greece is too big. Some pensions in Greece have increased much more quickly than in other European countries, and to compare with Portugal, we're speaking with the IMF. There were many situations in Greece which were a lot better, even though the economic strength isn't different. I wouldn't like to speak about the Baltic countries who carried out incredible reforms and are now on the path of economic growth. In the middle of the global financial crisis, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia carried out incredible reforms, and today they have good economic growth rates. I always sit with my colleagues, and my Slovakian colleague, who is a social democrat, you need to talk to him about the Greek reform program. It isn't the situation that, as regards the new member states, who have made a lot of sacrifices and are saying very clearly to us what is necessary or not. And then once again, on to Guy Verhofstadt. 2 points. Don't get worked up. European policy is almost domestic policies. It's like at home in Parliament. That's wonderful. We don't always agree. Almost. You don't know the German Social Democrats, Mr. Swoboda. Well, he does know the German Social Democrats, says the chairman, the President of Parliament. He doesn't know them, says the Chancellor, when they're interacting with the CDU. But the debt redemption fund, apart from the fact that we don't have a European legal basis, we need to have at least a treaty change. But it doesn't help us in the current situation. None of the countries with the great indebtedness has a chance to pay back their debts. On the contrary, these countries must try to get down their high deficits. And I don't think that that's a good response. And if you say there's no two-pack if we don't agree to the debt fund, that isn't a good message if we want to try to find a compromise. But I have noted it. I agree with Mr. Swoboda. The UK was always a country that was in favour of enlargement, and if you want to enlarge the EU, you must be in favour of coherence in the Union. At the moment, we have a huge crisis with the euro, but we will have a big crisis if the economic power of Europe, also the non-euro countries, doesn't come together. In the past, we did things correctly. Our structural and cohesion funds, we should have had more flexibility. And I think we've learned from that. The structural funds at the moment are being spent much more flexibly, for example, to combat youth unemployment, etc., in connection with SMEs. We've learned a lot of lessons. Joseph Daul, I would say the following. Germany was the country which proposed, together with France, that we'd have this summit now on the budget and not wait, because for the perception of Europe in the world, of the question of how much investment is available for Europe, this budget is important. If we have a phase, if we don't know who can invest in 2014, and not just Euro countries, also non-Euro countries in Central and Eastern Europe, almost all the investment comes from the Structural and Cohesion Fund. So we'd give a poor signal if we weren't to agree now. And as regard research policy, I'm in favour, of course. And in our presidency, we had the European Research Council, which we took forward. And we must give a modern look to our budget. But if every year, if we have a 40% increase in ITER every year, that will end one day. I don't want to end ITER. That wasn't my message. We'll have to see how we can deploy our funds sensibly. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for a pleasant afternoon.
Meine Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Chancellor. Finally, can I just make 3 announcements? First of all, the Open Conference of Presidents has had a much higher rate of attendance than an equivalent plenary session, so I think that gives us food for thought. Secondly, Mrs. Merkel, yes, I know you've heard that point about ITER, doing away with ITER. No, no, says the Chancellor. Secondly, Chancellor, and as President of this House, I do very much want to get this across. You said something important. Anything that happens at European level is, as an important member of Council, the European Parliament is the partner, and it gives democratic legitimacy to the European matters. Thank you for that statement, and I would like to hear that being reflected in the European Council, and I hope you would influence things in that way, and I hope you'll. I would urge you to influence that. You talked about Latvia. Mr. Dombrovskis said in this room, as far as I know, made a speech, and Mr. Dombrovskis talked about the enormous sacrifices his country made to become a member of the European Union, and he said, if the response to the EU, to my people, was to adopt a budget whereby they wouldn't get any cohesion fund money, after all the sacrifices that were made, it would be similar to the Slovakian member we were talking about. Well, that would be the end of support for the EU. So, in this budget, it's not just about a few billion here and there. It's about the spirit of solidarity that should prevail in Europe, and I'm thankful that you referred to that. You also talked about the German Social Democrats. Well, it's much better here than it is in the German Parliament. You said that too. And secondly, the Social Democrats are a factor for stability in European policy. I'm sure you all agree with me when I say that. Thank you very much.